Jennifer is a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. She's the author of several Brookings publications, co-edited the Retooling for Growth, Building a 21st Century Economy in America's Older Industrial Area, which was published by the American Assembly and the Brookings Institution Press. Prior to joining Brookings, Jennifer was a community planning and development specialist at the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, where she assisted urban empowerment zones in implementing their strategic plans. Not surprisingly, Jennifer loves old cities. So we have one here that's 199 years old. So we appreciate you being here and know you've gotten to see a little bit of that, and we're anxious to hear your comments. So please help me in welcoming Jennifer Vey.
I like the music introduction here. Thanks so much, Dan, and thanks so much to all of you for having me here today. I was able to come in yesterday and take a look around a little bit with Betsy McCaw, and got to see all the exciting things that are happening here in Indianapolis. So I'm really pleased to be here today to talk about this topic, innovation districts. So I'm going to grab my clicker here. So what I'm going to do today is talk about, again, this topic, and it really comes out of work that Brookings has been doing for the last several years. So just through our own travels and research, we had been observing, both in this country but abroad as well, particularly in Europe, this new shifting spatial geography of innovation. And in our travels and in just being out and about, we were starting to see these enclaves growing up around innovative activity. And so we were doing our observations, beginning to do some research, and realizing, wow, there's something we're onto something here that we really need to explore. So a year ago, June, we put out a report called The Rise of Innovation Districts. Hopefully some of you have seen it. If you haven't and want to, you can download it from our website. But what that report did was really just start to lay out what's happening, what we were seeing, what we thought was driving it, the major trends, what we thought was going on within the innovation districts that were emerging, and then start to point to some directions that local leaders could take in order to make to leverage some of the assets that they have and try to develop their own innovation districts. So what I'm going to talk about today is really based on that work and a lot of the work that we've done since then. So I'll mention now, and we're very excited that last week we just announced a new initiative at Brookings called the Bass Initiative on Innovation and Placemaking that we're involved in with a group called Project for Public Spaces out of New York. And this is sort of our next wave of this work. So we've been, we were doing the innovation district work, doing a lot of this observation and research. We wrote the report last year. We've been doing a lot of work since, saying, wow, we seem to have struck on something here. It's really struck a chord with folks, because as soon as the report was released, the phone was sort of ringing off the hook, and with cities all over the place calling and saying, we see something like this happening in our own community. And for some places, they were further down the trajectory. Other places, it might have been just something nascent, or they knew they had the assets and they wanted to do something with them. So it was after that we really realized, well, our report, which we knew, just scratched the surface, and there was a lot more work to be done. So we're really pleased that with funding from Robert and Ann Bass, we were able to launch this initiative with PPS, and intend to do a lot more work over the next 18 months and hopefully beyond that in this space around innovation communities. So I want to just start off talking about what we see, what the trends are, and why we think we're seeing this rise of innovation districts. So if you think about where innovation occurred back in the 19th century, it was in industrial districts. And these districts were located in urban areas for obviously very good locational reasons. They were taking advantage of waterways, energy sources, and other things. So they were really located in dense areas where their workers were also located, and all the services and whatnot that they needed. But then if you sort of flash forward to the middle part of the 20th century, that spatial geography had been shifting, and where we were seeing innovation happen was predominantly in a much more suburban-like setting in suburban research parks. And that was for a number of reasons. You know, for one thing, it was just following the trends of the nation. As we were becoming a much more suburban nation, certainly, you know, these trends around research parks was just part of that overall trend. We were also in the post-World War II era where this was a time where a lot of researchers and companies wanted to keep their research secret. So it made sense that you drove your car up into this, you know, research park, you went inside your building, and there probably wasn't a lot of collaboration, perhaps even with your colleagues, let alone with the company located next door. But if you move forward to today, this is where we're really seeing this rise of a different type of spatial geography of innovation, whereby you're seeing that a move back to more urbanized areas. And there's a number of reasons for this, really. One, demographic changes and preferences that are causing workers, particularly talented workers, highly educated workers, to be demanding a different type of environment in which they want to live and in which they want to work, and that tends to be a more vibrant kind of urban environment. At the same time, we're seeing dramatic shifts in innovation itself, where the policy of wanting to keep those secret really wasn't working out so well anymore, and where innovation itself is becoming far more collaborative in nature, both collaborative within particular sectors, much more open, and also more collaborative across sectors as well. And with that, there's becoming a greater demand for proximity. And so what we're seeing in these districts is that firms are starting to make these choices to want to locate not only near other firms, but they want to locate to more startup activity so they can see what's going on in terms of research that's being undertaken and new things that are being developed. And they want to be near major anchor institutions as well. And it's these market trends and these demographic trends that are really coming together to shift the geography and to start causing the development of these innovation districts.
The geography of innovation is shifting. To find the innovative economy 20 years ago, a worker needed to drive to a secluded research park, work in isolation, and keep ideas secret. Today, proximity is everything. Workers want to be in urban places that are walkable, bikeable, hyper-caffeinated, where they can bump into other workers and share ideas. Firms also want to be close to other firms, research labs, and universities in collaborative spaces so that smart ideas can be turned into smart products for the market. Innovation districts are this century's productive geography. They are both competitive places and cool spaces, and they will transform your city and metropolis.
So that's sort of a nifty animation that we worked on last year, and that's actually my boss, Bruce Katz. Many of you might have met him in the past doing the voiceover. So who knew that he might have a second career doing voiceover work? But it's a pretty nice, neat, tidy summary of what we really see happening in the marketplace. So our definition of innovation districts, ours and increasingly and others, is geographic areas where anchor institutions and companies cluster and connect with small firms, startups, business incubators, accelerators. But these are also places where there's not just a lot of innovative economic activity, but where you're seeing a lot of the physical activity, the placemaking going on as well. So these are areas that tend to be very transit accessible. They naturally need to be pretty wired and have that technical ability. And they as they grow up, they typically offer mixed-use housing, amenities like parks and open spaces, cultural activities, those sorts of things that make them not just, again, economic spaces, but really dynamic spaces where people want to live and work. And that's really the power of the concept, is where these two things, innovation and placemaking, really come together. So when we talk about innovation districts, and what we really highlight in the paper are a few typologies of what we were seeing. So the first major typology, and that really pretty much, where most innovation districts sort of fit under, is what we were calling the Anchor Plus model. And these are really areas within cities, within urban areas, where you have anchor institutions, tier 1 research institutions, predominantly major medical centers, occasionally even anchors that might be something like a large other independent research institution or a large firm. But these are areas really that have these anchors and where you're seeing this clustering of other type of activity grow up around it. The second major type that we've identified is what we're calling reimagined urban areas. And these tend to be places often in very sort of hot market cities where there's affordability pressures on land, where there may be space available, and where there's really an opportunity to sort of revitalize that area and bring in those innovation assets. So typically these may not have major anchor institutions already located there, though they may come in after the fact. But where they're developing often on older industrial land that's available along a waterfront. Even here, I think if you look at the 16 Tech area, it sort of fits this model where you have a lot of land availability that gives you a lot of opportunity to grow and develop. And then the third major type that we've identified, and in some ways is the most validating, is this urbanized science park. So these are areas typically outside of the city that fit more of that traditional research park, suburban research park model, and where they are now saying, wow, that model worked for us for a long time, but now we're starting to see competition from some of these other areas. Research Triangle Park is a great example. Obviously a very successful research park for many decades, but they were starting to see that competition from Raleigh and from Durham. And they said, wow, I think we need to think about this and think about how we're responding. And they're going through a master planning process to basically create kind of a town center environment within the park to, again, appeal to the talent and appeal to the firms that want to have a more dynamic environment within that space. So they're doing it in a very authentic kind of way to that particular park. But what it shows is that even in the more traditional suburban parks, they're starting to recognize the trends that are afoot and trying to figure out how they can be responsive to them. So what I want to do now, that sort of gives the overview of why we're seeing this shift, what it's all about. But what I want to do now is sort of delve a little bit within districts to say, all right, what are the components of the districts and what are we seeing going on inside them? So what we really talk about is that these districts and the innovation ecosystem that's growing in these districts really is where you have three types of assets coming together: economic assets, physical assets, and networking assets. So I'm going to talk a little bit about each of these and give some examples of what we are seeing. So when we talk about economic assets, first of all, again, we're talking about anchor institutions. This happens to be a picture of Drexel University. But these again are typically your large-scale medical centers, your tier 1 research institutions, occasionally large firms and others. But these are really the anchors around which you're seeing a lot of this activity. In addition to anchor institutions, we're also seeing high-value research-oriented firms. So again, when we're talking about innovation, this is really the innovation and innovation districts. These are the firms that are really engaged in research, R&D type of activity. We're seeing firms in more highly creative fields, so this happens to be an example of a gaming company, but in many of these districts, you're starting to see that creative aspect and creative type firms that are starting to merge, even in areas that might have been predominantly a life sciences area. We're seeing other types of economic activity, other types of innovative firms coming into those districts for the same reason, because they want that proximity. And then we're also seeing small batch manufacturing. As a lot of manufacturing becomes lighter and leaner and greener, it allows more opportunity for manufacturing to be going into smaller spaces, even within urban areas. So this picture here is actually of a robot called Artie. It's a company called Artaic. It's located in the Boston Innovation District. I actually had a chance to see this guy at work. The company makes large-scale mosaics for things like hotels. So it's taking what used to be an incredibly, and still is in many places, an incredibly labor-intensive kind of creative art. And because they're doing such large-scale type mosaics, they actually developed this robot who's able to do it. But you won't actually know that it was there. If you go down to the Seaport area in Boston, you've got various types of firms that are located in this kind of warehouse area, and behind the door you wouldn't know that there's actually a small manufacturer located there. So increasingly, we're seeing this mix of all these types of entities located within these districts. So the second major asset that we see are the physical assets. Okay, so again, these aren't just areas of innovative economic activity, but these are areas that typically have physical assets to go along with it, and particularly those that really animate the spaces. So what you can see in this sort of series of slides is you've got Barcelona on the end, you've got Eindhoven on the other end, and on the far right, I guess from your vantage point. And in the middle, that's actually Detroit. That's Campus Martius Park. If any of you have been there, it's located right in kind of the heart of downtown. And it's an area that had one time been the center of Detroit's activity, had gone into decline, and if you kind of look at aerial shots, it was a bit of a dead zone. And years ago, they decided that this was really important to reinvigorate this public space in part as a means to drive more economic activity. And so, now this park has been revitalized. They have a tremendous amount of programming, and as you can see, I don't know actually in this picture what particular event's going on, but you can see it's now just a well-utilized park and provides a major amenity and a major place where people in the downtown area, which is increasingly becoming a major tech center, where they can gather. Another kind of physical asset is not just what's happening in the public realm outside, but also what's happening within spaces as well. So this happens to be an example from Cortex, but what we're seeing within spaces are the kind of spaces that bring people together in new ways. So that includes things like incubator spaces, various types of co-working spaces, particularly even those that, like in this case, are co-working laboratory spaces where the ability to be able to share very, very high-end equipment, very, very expensive equipment, allows new entrepreneurs to be focusing on their business and on their research without having to worry as much about how you raise all the capital to be able to buy extraordinarily expensive equipment because of this sharing sort of model. So within any of these districts, when we talk about physical assets, it's creating the physical spaces that allow people to come together in new ways, that allow people to share space, that allow people to start their business without maybe that overhead that they might have had in years past. Another type of physical asset are other types of buildings and spaces that bring people together. So this is a rendering now built of District Hall in the Boston Innovation Districts. This is an example of, it was a public-private partnership that got this building built. And it's a really interesting example of an area. If you've been to the Boston Innovation District, it was one of those reimagined kind of urban areas where there was a fair bit of land available and that didn't already have that dense urban fabric. And so as the district was beginning to develop, they recognized that they needed that sort of space. There was a public space that people could come into and utilize. So District Hall has a coffee shop located within it. It has a restaurant located within it. Has walls that can be moved, that go up and down, that have, that are whiteboards so that you can write on them, so that people can come in and have informal meetings with one or two other people. They can hold a larger meeting. They hold major events there and conferences. It's actually programmed by the Venture Cafe Foundation. And it just allows that kind of public gathering space. And while District Hall is somewhat unique, I think many innovation districts are trying to, or emerging innovation districts, are trying to figure out how they might create similar spaces for themselves. I know that's what's going on here in the 16 Tech area of thinking about a similar type of model. In other places, they're thinking about either how to repurpose an existing building or even how you use things like public libraries in new ways so that you can create that kind of space where people can come together. And finally, when we talk about physical assets, we're talking about the large-scale infrastructure kind of moves or assets that you need to be focusing on. So this is an example of Stockholm, how it exists now. This is their life sciences area, and you can see the major highways running through it. It's very cut off, and you can see what their plan is for 2025, which involves capping over the highway. So, in many of these districts, you've got some of the same issues, particularly highways that might be dividing them up, for example, other just major type of infrastructure needs that help knit together the urban fabric in a better way. So, as for many of these districts, these are the type of moves that they're starting to contemplate of how do we make sure that we're creating that kind of density that allows good things to happen. And then the third kind of asset is our networking assets. And these are a little bit harder to get your arms around. But this is really kind of what brings people together. So, if you look at our diagram, there's a reason why it also all comes together, because there's a lot of overlap clearly between the economic and the physical and the networking assets. But the networking assets are things like, here's an example of tech regulars in Eindhoven. We talk about them in terms of strong ties and weak ties. So they're the type of programming and events and other types of activities that, one, bring people together who are located within the same industry sector, who already might have strong relationships, but these are ways that through events and programmings and meetups and mashups, and also creating the physical spaces that allow people to come together to network, that happen within sectors. But we also talk about weak ties. This happens to be a picture from Barcelona, but also, how do you create the opportunities for people within different sectors to come together in new ways where they might not have before? And I think for some places this is a challenge. When we go into places and you're discussing kind of the collaborative culture or lack thereof that might exist, oftentimes people will say, well, within our sector, we have good ways to get together. We have good ways to network with one another, but we don't have kind of the infrastructure to be able to do that with other sectors, say healthcare and energy, which we're seeing in some markets that we're working in, or IT and health. So, how do you create those kind of opportunities, both formal and informal opportunities for people to get together? So what I want to talk about a little is what are we seeing in how does this relate to the Indianapolis metro area? So I'm going to sort of start with a view of the metro area, just give a few kind of an overview of the area, and then look a little bit within where your emerging innovation district is. So you can see outline of the counties in the metro area with Indianapolis at the heart. And so, I'm sure most of you are, quite familiar with a lot of these statistics. You've got, a metro population that's pushing 2 million, an economic output of $126.5 billion, which actually ranks you about 25th among the top 100 metros. And we've done a lot of work just tracking growth in places since the recession and how well metros are recovering. So you can see, since the fourth quarter, kind of the trough here, after the Great Recession, you can see that you've had pretty robust employment growth, pushing 12%, and output growth at about 9%. So this just gives you kind of the snapshot of where your metro economy is. In terms of the workforce, we've identified STEM jobs, which Jonathan Rothwell, one of my colleagues, has done extensive work on identifying, what makes a STEM job, what makes a STEM occupation. Indianapolis is ranked about 27th among the top 100 metros in terms of the sheer number of STEM jobs, and about 25th in terms of the overall share of your economy that's dominated by STEM jobs. So clearly you've got a lot of those jobs here, and as we define STEM, these aren't necessarily just your master's and PhD level jobs. These sort of run the gamut, whereby 50% of these jobs actually don't even require a four-year college degree. So these are important jobs for communities to be understanding and measuring, because they're driving a lot of economic activity in their areas, and they also provide good, well-paying jobs across the spectrum. So in terms of the innovation, if you look at the metro capacity overall, ranked 43rd out of 358 metros in terms of the average number of patents during that 4-year period from 2007 to 2011, the latest that we can get data, and about 0.6 patents per 1,000 jobs, which gives you sort of a better indication based on the size of your metro and your workforce of your patenting activity. They're not quite as high, but still within that sort of top third. So if you look at where those STEM occupations are, I think probably not surprising for most people in this room, a lot of them are in health, diagnosing and treating practitioners. So this is basically you have a strong healthcare industry here, and it employs a lot of STEM workers. And that's not so unusual. In a lot of markets, healthcare is a pretty big driver of their overall STEM economy. But you also have a substantial amount of computer occupations in the construction trades, which we also count as part of STEM, finance, robust engineering here, and on down. So this, again, just gives you kind of the overview of when we talk about STEM for this market, what are we really talking about, and what kind of occupations are people involved in. So here what I want to do is take sort of this broad metro perspective and zoom it in a little bit, literally zoom it in a little bit using this nifty Google Maps tool. So you can see downtown Indianapolis, west, east, Warren Park. And here we go. So if coming back to this conversation around assets, around economic assets, around physical assets, what I wanted to do is sort of take a look at, well, what's going on here in Indianapolis in terms of the assets, particularly in your emerging innovation community, innovation district in the 16 Tech area. So, what you can see, from this map are how all these assets are coming together. So you can see up in the top here, the area that's going to be the growing 16 Tech area, where you have IBRI, which will be the anchor for that innovation community. But then you can also see the various other assets that are ringing this area. And that's really important because, again, we're talking about proximity. We're talking about proximity to the other assets that are located in the broader Indianapolis area, certainly even what are those connections to the broader metro as well. But in this space, you can see that see what the geography is here of how all these major anchors are aligning. And then, this sort of just overlays some of the physical assets. And I know, transit is one of the things that will be top of mind as this gets going. You do have the people mover that already exists. You have, the river trail that you can see, on the map here. But moving forward, as you think about the physical assets, and as this place develops, this will be a lot about creating those spaces, the mixed-use kind of spaces, the housing, the retail, the other amenities. There's a lot of opportunities certainly around open space and parkland. A lot of potential there. You've got the major, the river and other waterways that offer other opportunities to build in those physical assets so that, again, you're creating that kind of environment where people want to be, where people want to work, and that allows people to be coming together and interacting. And then finally, networking assets. And these are, again, sometimes a little harder to identify, but I think part of what will happen in this area is as you have all this development happening, there's the opportunity to be creating more opportunities for those networking for networking to come together. So you already certainly have organizations like BioCrossroads that's serving that purpose now. And as they develop and as more spaces are created, co-working spaces, maker spaces, other types of spaces in this area, it provides all that much more opportunity to create those networking opportunities. Again, both informally, but also sort of via the formal structures and the formal organizations like a BioCrossroads or like a Tech Point that can really help provide that and provide those opportunities. So finally, what I want to talk about now is to sort of shift to, all right, here's what we're seeing, here's where we've been, here's what these places look like when you look within them, here's some of the opportunities here in Indianapolis, but then to sort of point directionally forward for, all right, if you're, for the stakeholders in any given metro area, what do they really need to be thinking about if they want to build on those assets, leverage those assets, and really create an innovation district in their own community? So the first thing that we really focus on is this idea around creating the network. For any place where we're seeing emerging innovation districts or even innovation districts that are sort of further along, they really need to have that network of people that are coming together, the stakeholders that are coming together around a unified kind of vision. So, what those networks look like or who the driver of them can be different in different places. In some cases, it might be more driven by government, in some cases by another organization. But they're rarely also ever completely driven by just one person. There might be one person or one organization. There might be leadership there that's sort of pushing everybody else along, but it's really bringing all the relevant stakeholders to the table in that area so that they can be thinking about their vision. So, by way of example, when we look about different network models, and there's many, out there, you can see that when in the waterfront area and the innovation district in Boston, this was literally driven by the mayor. Mayor Menino, the former mayor of Boston, declared that they wanted an innovation district in this area. They could see what was happening, certainly in Kendall Square, which was, becoming unaffordable for companies. As the waterfront was opened up because of the Big Dig, because of the Silver Line going in, there was land available. And, it's a rich market in terms of the innovation capacity in the wider metro area. So I think he saw an opportunity there to essentially designate this area. And they made some big moves along the way to help start to create this innovation district. In other places, I used the example of Research Triangle Park earlier. That whole master planning process was led by the Research Triangle Park Foundation. So they were the driving entity. They are the entity for the park, that unifying entity. So they were the ones that were really behind this master planning process that I described. And then in other places, and this is probably really the most typical, it's really just a grouping of various stakeholders that are coming together. Again, often maybe driven by one particular organization who's sort of taking that leadership role. But, if you look at the University City and Central City District in Philadelphia, it's a lot of different organizations and anchors that are beginning to come together in new and collaborative ways to drive their innovation district and drive that capacity forward. There's a lot of anchors in this particular area, but they see the opportunity to be basically performing better than they've been, but recognizing that it'll take a much more coordinated effort to move from where they are now to where they want to go. So once that network is in place, the next important thing is to do what we're referring to as auditing your assets. The idea here is that you have to understand who you are and what you do best. And then from there be able to figure out, as I'll talk about in a minute, the strategies to move you forward. So what we've been doing is trying to develop what we're calling an asset audit template or a tool. We've been playing around with this for about a year with a group called Mass Economics out of Cambridge, Massachusetts, to develop a sort of a template of data points around economic assets, physical assets, networking assets that really helps places understand who they are, what they do best, where their challenges are. So this audit is a mix of intensive quantitative type work, but also a lot of qualitative work too. We're actually doing some work in Philadelphia and also in Oklahoma City of doing kind of this full-on audit to really understand these places and use that to then help inform some strategic moves for those two districts. What we ultimately actually hope to do is, after we sort of perfect this or at least make it better and more useful, what we hope to do is create a guide so that other places can learn from what we've been learning through the application of this tool so that other places can understand the importance of auditing your assets and also understand some of the best ways to do that. What's important to measure? Why do we want to measure certain points over others? What does it really tell us about our place? So what I'm going to show here is just, and I won't go into detail on all these data points, but just to give you kind of a very light flavor of what we've been doing. In the Philadelphia University City District, we looked at, range of economic assets. So these include things like employment by firm size. All right, do you have big employers, or are you really dominated by small companies? You can see in Philly, they're pretty dominated by the big guys. What's your anchor employment? How dominated are you? In Philadelphia, this was pretty important to look at because they're pretty dominated by major anchor institutions in this University City area. The other places here are Kendall, the Detroit Innovation District, and Texas Medical Center, just by way of comparison. So you can see that they're more dominated than other places by major anchor institutions. And then you can see, we were measuring things like research and development staff. This is, again, we are doing dozens and dozens of different stats that we're tracking for these places and trying to figure out how you can best create a framework and tell a story about what's happening in these districts. But I think this sort of just gives you the idea of what we're after here. Same for physical assets. This is really trying to understand, what your place is, and beyond just the things you can measure, like things like broadband, things like transit stops, things like even tree coverage or parkland, the things that you can actually either measure, from a public data source or measure on the ground. We also are working with PPS, again, Project for Public Spaces, to really try to get at that placemaking and really understand better, do you have the kind of spaces that are bringing people together and that feel very inclusive? So, recognizing that this physical piece, that this placemaking piece is so important to the overall health and success of innovation districts, we're trying to figure out how is the best way that you can understand what's happening in your area and kind of create that baseline from which you can track moving forward. And then finally, networking assets. This we were trying to experiment a little bit with, well, how do you actually measure that in some robust way so that you can actually track it over time? We were experimenting with a few different data points here. Things like, are people living, and working in the same area? How far are they from their place of work? Are there a lot of late night amenities in the place that might be bringing people together and keeping people in the district after hours? For the most part, networking assets are something that you have to track and understand at a much more granular and local and more qualitative level. So that's what we're trying to do in some of these communities that we're working in. And then finally, strategies. So, you're creating your network, you're setting that kind of unified vision. You're auditing your assets, you're understanding who you are, what you do best, where you might be underperforming. And then the idea is to be able to use that knowledge to really inform the strategic moves that you want to make in order to develop your innovation district. So when we talk about strategies, we mean a few key things. One, innovation. And while this seems self-evident, we call these innovation districts. In many communities, I think places that want an innovation district but may not actually have yet, anyway, a lot of innovation going on. They're more sort of activity centers or mixed-use developments without that strong innovation component. So this is obviously key. We just give the example here of Cortex. I won't go into detail because we're going to be talking about that on our panel. But here's an area where obviously innovation is the focus through the Cortex development and now with CIC and Tech Shop and all the activity that's surrounding that development. Placemaking, as I mentioned, this is really a key component to making these places work. These aren't just areas where you have a lot of innovation like you might have been seeing in your more traditional suburban parks, where you have a lot of R&D activity, but you don't have that important placemaking component. So Barcelona, one of the early innovation districts, has focused heavily on this. Other places are as well. And in other places, it's an area where they still need to do some work. Even in some of the urban areas, where there's a lot of firms, there's a lot of activity, but they may not be fully there when it comes to creating those good and vibrant physical spaces. Inclusion. This is an issue I think is really top of mind for all the innovation districts as they're developing, of how do you make sure that as your innovation district is growing, as you're creating as more firms are locating there, as you're creating more jobs, as you're creating more physical development, that these aren't just kind of isolated enclaves of where you have highly educated people, not very diverse, working in a spot in a place, but where others within your community don't feel like they're a part of it or don't feel like they have access. So this inclusion piece is really important, and I think when we talk about it in terms of physical inclusion. How do you make sure that, because a lot of these districts are actually located sort of nested within or very proximate to low-income neighborhoods, how do you make sure as they're developing that those neighborhoods are part of that process and that they feel like this is a development that benefits them and that revitalization benefits them? It's also about workforce development and creating that pipeline. These districts, as they grow up, need all sorts of jobs, ranging from STEM-type jobs that again run the spectrum, to service-type jobs as they grow up in these areas and as these areas develop. So how do you make sure that you're creating those pipelines of talent, starting with your K-12 systems, through community colleges, through universities, that can allow people to get the skills that they need to be able to participate in the economy as it begins to grow. And we also talk about entrepreneurship as well. How do you create opportunities as these places grow and as the need for goods and services grows in these places? How do you make sure that minority communities, for example, or low-income people who have an entrepreneurial spirit but don't maybe know how to get started, how do you create the supports to allow them to seize on those opportunities? So here's an example of Baltimore, and I think we can talk about this a little bit on the panel as well. I just use the example of in the University of Maryland Biopark area, which is located on the western end of downtown, where the university has developed their biopark. There's some interesting things that they're working on in terms of inclusion. One, they are part of a wider partnership with their surrounding communities, another hospital that's located nearby, and some cultural institutions in this what they call the Southwest Partnership. And it's really been a multi-year effort to really focus on how, as a larger community, they can come together to really benefit from the growth that they anticipate happening, and how to drive a lot of that growth so that it benefits all those communities that are located in that area. What's also interesting from a workforce perspective is that the community college actually has their life sciences program located right in the biopark. So the rest of Baltimore City's community college is located a few miles away in a different part of town, but they actually located their life sciences department right in one of the buildings. So now these students can be coming in and having access to the companies for internships and other types of opportunities right there, instead of having to come across town. They also have a partnership with a local high school that has a health sciences curriculum to create that pipeline as well. So there are other examples from around the country, but these are a few ways that, both from a physical development perspective, but also from a workforce perspective, Baltimore is really trying to focus on this issue of inclusion and participation. And then finally, capital investment. Clearly, if you want to be growing an innovation district, you need the money to be able to do that. You need money for development. You need money for entrepreneurs, everything from seed capital through angel investments, venture capital, to be able to support those firms both as they're starting and as they're growing. So we use the example of BioCrossroads here, a support organization for the life sciences industry. We have other examples, from around the country, and I think this is something that's going to be increasingly important for places to be figuring out new and more creative ways to be financing district development, partly from more of a place-based perspective, which we don't often see, certainly in the finance community, where there's a focus on developing particular places in smaller geographies, as opposed to, in most, even in the finance community, where things tend to be very, very siloed. So this is an area on capital investment that we'll certainly be focusing on in our work in the years to come. So with that, Again, hopefully gives you the broad overview of what we've been seeing in the marketplace in terms of the rise of innovation districts, why they're happening, what they look like, and how places can move forward. And now I think we're going to be bringing up a stellar group of panelists to really delve more deeply on a lot of these topics. So thank you.